There's a filing cabinet tucked away inside the Library of Congress, and inside it are the voices of people who are long gone. Not recordings, nothing you can play back, but transcriptions. Page after page of interviews, handwritten and typed, collected between 1936 and 1940. Government writers were sent into homes across 24 states with one simple instruction: get their stories before they disappear. This effort was called the Federal Writers Project, part of Roosevelt's New Deal. It gave work to unemployed journalists, novelists, and researchers during the Great Depression. But what they produced became something far more valuable than a paycheck. They documented 2,900 life histories, real people, ordinary Americans, telling their stories in their own words. Then those stories were filed away in the Library of Congress and mostly forgotten for decades. I didn't go looking for them. I was chasing something else entirely: architectural records from the 1870s. I kept running into a question I couldn't shake. Why do so many courthouses and government buildings from that era feel off? The proportions don't quite match the people who were supposed to use them. Doorways too large, ceilings too high, spaces that seem built for something or someone different. But the deeper I went into the archives, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real mystery. The people were. Because those 2,900 interviews captured something no textbook ever could: first-hand memories from Americans who lived before everything changed. And what they remembered doesn't quite line up with the history we've been taught. To understand what I mean by before everything changed, you have to look at the timeline. Take a person born in 1855. If they lived to 85, which wasn't unusual, they would have died around 1940. That means they were alive, fully capable of remembering and speaking, when those government writers came knocking on their doors in the late 1930s. They would have been children in the 1860s and 1870s. They would have witnessed one of the most dramatic transformations in American history. Not slowly, not over centuries, but within a single lifetime. And their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard those stories directly from them. That makes those grandchildren the last generation connected to the old world through living memory, and they're almost gone. Consider Mary Kelly, born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan. She lived to be 113 and died in 1964. She was alive before the Civil War and lived long enough to see televisions glowing in American living rooms. Or Maggie Barnes, born in the early 1880s to a formerly enslaved woman. She lived to around 115, passing away in North Carolina in 1998. These weren't isolated cases. The Gerontology Research Group has verified at least 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s alone. Dozens more lived past 100. Hundreds reached their 90s. That's an entire generation of witnesses, people whose memories stretched across two completely different worlds. The government had a chance to record all of them. It recorded 2,900. And then it stopped. In 1939, after congressional hearings, funding for the Federal Writers Project was cut. Control shifted to the states, and the effort quietly faded out. The interviews were boxed up, filed away, and not widely published or accessible until the 1970s. 30 years of silence. 30 years during which the last first-hand testimonies of Americans who remembered what came before were effectively hidden from view. Before what exactly? That's where things start to get harder to ignore. October 8, 1871. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire. The story is simple, almost comforting in its familiarity. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, a wooden city. Flames spreading quickly, then rebuilding, But almost no one talks about what happened that same night, at the same time, across multiple states. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm erased an entire town in roughly an hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people died, making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. The fire consumed 1.2 million acres. Survivors described winds so powerful they could lift adults off the ground. Flames that moved faster than a person could run. Heat so intense that people crossing open spaces burst into flames without ever touching visible fire. Reverend Peter Pernin, who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, later published his account in 1874. What he described doesn't behave like a normal wildfire. The oxygen seemed to vanish. People were found dead without burns, as if the air itself had been stripped away. The fire created its own weather system, a violent vortex of superheated wind, expanding outward like an explosion rather than spreading like a forest fire. And it wasn't just Peshtigo. That same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron was threatened. Across roughly 225 million acres of the upper Midwest, fires ignited almost simultaneously. The National Weather Service confirms it. Multiple massive fires across 3 states on the same evening. The official explanation points to drought conditions, leftover lumber debris, and a cold front with strong winds. That sounds reasonable, until you focus on one detail that's bothered researchers for over a century. They all started at the same time. In 1883, a theory emerged suggesting fragments of Biela's comet might have entered Earth's atmosphere, igniting fires from above. The idea resurfaced in a 1997 documentary and was examined again in 2004 by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago even reported blue flames burning in basements, something more consistent with unusual chemical combustion than ordinary wood fires. The theory has never been proven, but it's never been disproven either. And here's why that matters. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s were children in 1871. A 70-year-old interviewed in 1938 would have been 3 years old that night. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to remember the sky turning red, old enough to hear exactly what their parents said happened. The Library of Congress describes those 2,900 interviews as containing stories about surviving the Chicago fire and pioneer life. But that description barely scratches the surface. What else did they remember? What did they tell those government writers about the night everything burned? And why did the project end before anyone could piece together the full picture? The fires weren't the only thing that disappeared. In 1890, the United States carried out what was, at the time, the most detailed census in its history. For the first time, each household filled out an entire form. It didn't just count people, it recorded who they were, immigration status, naturalization, whether they spoke English, whether they owned their home, even Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans documented in extraordinary detail. And for the first time since the country began taking censuses in 1790, something changed. There were no local backup copies. Every previous census had been duplicated and stored in county courthouses and state archives. But the 1890 census, it existed in one place only, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Then, on January 10th, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. Roughly a quarter of the records were destroyed immediately. Another half were damaged by water and smoke. The official investigation never landed on a clear cause. Some said it was a discarded cigarette. Others blamed faulty wiring. There were even suggestions of spontaneous combustion from materials stored nearby. But the fire itself isn't the most unsettling part. What happened after is, the surviving records, potentially half still usable, were moved into storage. And then, nothing. No restoration. No urgent effort to preserve what remained. No attempt to copy or salvage the data. For 12 years, they just sat there. Then, in December of 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent a list to the Librarian of Congress. It was a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on it. The librarian was asked to identify anything worth saving for historical purposes. He identified nothing. On February 21, 1933, Congress approved the destruction. And here's the part that's hard to ignore. The very next day, February 22nd, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, a fireproof facility specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records. One day before beginning construction of the building that would have protected them. Out of 62.9 million names, only about 6,160 survived. The most detailed snapshot of every American alive during that transition period. Gone. Not erased in a single dramatic moment, but removed step by step. Fire. Neglect. Bureaucratic approval. Final destruction. Each step on its own can be explained. Together, they start to look like something else. And then there were the children. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were placed on trains in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and sent westward into rural communities. This was the orphan train movement, organized largely by the Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, along with support from institutions like the New York Foundling Hospital. At each stop, the children were presented to local families, not quietly, not privately. Accounts from the time describe something closer to an auction. The children were lined up, examined, assessed. Families looked at their health, their strength, and chose which ones they wanted. Many of those children ended up working in fields. And here's something most people don't realize. Less than half of them were actually orphans. The rest were children of immigrants, children of poverty, children whose parents couldn't afford to feed them or couldn't fight the institutions that took them away. In the 1850s alone, an estimated 30,000 children were living on the streets of New York City. But there's another detail that rarely gets discussed. When these children arrived in their new homes, the older ones were often encouraged, sometimes forced, to cut all ties with their past. Their names were changed. Their origins were either poorly recorded or not recorded at all. The organizations running the program kept inconsistent records at best. Many of these children grew up without any clear sense of where they came from. When they became adults, when they had children and grandchildren of their own, they couldn't pass that history down. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know it. That's 250,000 Americans whose identities were effectively severed. An entire generation disconnected from their own past, not by accident, but by design. And look at the timing. The orphan trains ran from 1854 to 1929. The fires happened in 1871. Photographs of unusually large skeletal remains, so-called giant discoveries, appear frequently in newspapers between roughly 1850 and 1900. And then stop. Maps change. Regions like Tartaria quietly disappear from them in the mid-1800s. Architecture shifts too. Grand classical structures give way to simpler, more modern designs within the same window of time. And the 1890 census, The one record that would have documented every single person alive during this transition was eliminated. At some point, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts to feel like a pattern. Which brings us to 1893. Chicago again. The world's Columbian Exposition. Over the course of 6 months, 27 million people visited. More than 200 buildings spread across 630 acres of Jackson Park. It was called the White City. According to official history, these structures, massive domes rivaling European cathedrals, columns, sculptures with incredible precision, were built in under 2 years, using wood frames, plaster, cement, jute fiber. No cranes, no bulldozers, no modern machinery, just horse-drawn equipment, hand tools, and manual labor. 200 buildings, 630 acres, less than 24 months. And then, after only 6 months on display, almost all of it was destroyed, torn down, burned, removed. Only one major structure survived, the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, because it had been built fireproof to protect the artwork inside. Everything else disappeared, and it wasn't a one-time event. Paris, 1889. Buffalo, 1901. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. The same pattern, over and over. Build something extraordinary, massive, intricate, seemingly impossible. Open it to the public, then erase it. Completely. Now think about the people interviewed in the 1930s. Some of them had seen the White City with their own eyes. They had walked through those buildings as children or young adults. They had stood inside structures that didn't feel temporary, didn't feel improvised, didn't feel like something built quickly just for display. To them, it felt older, more permanent, like something that had already been there. And then it was gone. That's the part I keep coming back to, because there had to have been someone in nearly every county in America in the early 1950s. A woman, maybe, born in the late 1850s, living into her 90s, sitting in a quiet house, surrounded by grandchildren who had grown up listening to her stories. She would have told them about buildings that already felt ancient when she was young, structures the textbooks insisted had only just been built. She would have described doorways too large, halls too vast, spaces that didn't quite make sense for the people living in them. She would have talked about the night the sky turned red, about fires that didn't behave like fires, about heat that moved faster than anyone could run, about stories her own parents told her, details passed down not from books, but from memory, from fear, from witnessing something they couldn't fully explain. She might have mentioned the trains, endless trains carrying children west, children with no names, no families, no pasts, children who arrived in new towns and were told to forget where they came from, to become someone else. And she would have described a world that felt different, not just in what it looked like, but in how it worked. Different proportions, different architecture, different knowledge. A sense that the world her grandchildren were growing up in wasn't quite the same one she had known. And when she spoke, when she tried to explain what she remembered, her grandchildren probably listened politely. Then they changed the subject, because her memories didn't match what they learned in school. And in 1950s America, the textbooks always won. The Federal Writers Project managed to capture some of these voices, 2,900 interviews from 24 states. But what about the other 24 states? What about the thousands of elderly Americans who were never interviewed? What about the stories that were never written down? The ones shared quietly across kitchen tables, on front porches, in hushed conversations before bed, in final moments, spoken to family members who didn't quite know what to do with what they were hearing. Those stories didn't disappear immediately. They were passed on to grandchildren. And those grandchildren are now in their 80s and 90s. They are the last living link, the final human connection to first-hand accounts of whatever existed before this transition. Because when you step back and look at the timeline, it's hard not to notice how precise it is. From the 1850s into the 1870s, that older style of architecture is everywhere. Massive buildings, oversized features, designs that don't quite match the scale of the people using them. Then, 1871, fires erupt across multiple states in a single night. In 1890, the census captures nearly 63 million Americans, every person alive during that period of change. And for the first time, there are no local backups, just one central copy. In the 1890s, something else happens quietly. The photographs of giants stop appearing. Reports of unusual skeletal discoveries fade away. Maps are redrawn. Entire regions, like Tartaria, vanish from them. In 1893, the White City rises in Chicago. Magnificent, impossible, temporary, and then disappears just as quickly. The orphan trains continue, relocating 250,000 children, cutting them off from their identities. In 1921, a fire damages the census. In 1933, what remains is deliberately destroyed. In 1936, the government suddenly rushes to interview the last surviving witnesses. 3 years later, the project is shut down. And by the 1950s, the last Americans who saw that earlier world with their own eyes are gone. Their grandchildren remain, but most of them stay silent, because the alternative is too much to process. And yet, those 2,900 interviews still exist. They're sitting in the Library of Congress. They've been publicly available since the 1970s. You can search them, you can read them. But here's the question that keeps bothering me. Has anyone actually gone through all of them? Not just skimming, not just pulling out familiar stories, but really digging, looking for the details that don't fit, the descriptions that don't align with the official record, the small, specific memories about buildings, fires, proportions, technologies, things that supposedly never existed, because the people who told those stories are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone, but their words are still there. And archives don't forget, even when everyone else does. The buildings remember, even if we don't. The documents hold on to what the encyclopedias left out. And somewhere in those 2,900 transcriptions, written down carefully by government workers during the Great Depression, capturing the memories of people born before the transition, there may be something we've been missing this entire time. Something overlooked. Something dismissed. Something that doesn't match what we've been told, but was remembered anyway. And it's still sitting there, in a filing cabinet, waiting, just like it has for nearly a century, for someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said, instead of what we were told they should have remembered.